You stir from your straw mattress before the sun even thinks about stretching. The air is cool, pressed with the scent of damp stone old parchment and a faint wisp of last night's tallow candle. You can hear the rhythmic breath of sleeping brothers, the quiet shuffle of robes, as one lone figure crosses the cloister, heading toward the tower with the bell rope. This is your alarm, not a digital chirp or buzzing phone. Just Brother Thomas rubbing his eyes and pulling on the cord that will wake the rest of the abbey. He rings the bell once, then again. The sound cuts through the hush like an iron whisper. You feel it in your bones, low, humming, persistent. It's not urgent, but it is unignorable. You rise, you have to, because in a medieval monastery, time isn't just a concept. It's a commandment. There's no snooze button, no excuse. The rule of Saint Benedict says prayer begins at a specific hour, and when the bell tolls, you go. The bell is cold too, metal wrapped in mystery. No one really knows who cast the first one, but by the time you're listening in the 9th or 10th century, these bells are everywhere in monasteries. Heavy things suspended in wooden towers rung with great effort by very sleepy humans. Historians still argue whether the earliest monasteries used bells consistently, or if it varied by region budget, and how much the abbot hated oversleeping. Some say the earliest timekeeping was done by knocking on doors with a stick. Others claim it started with chanting alone and bells came later when monks got tired of shouting down hallways. But here in this quiet abbey, the bell matters. It orders the world. You shuffle along the corridor, your sandals whispering against the floor. Candlelight flickers from the chapel. The sound of murmured voices gathers as monks assemble, each one wrapped in thick woolen robes, heads bowed, barely awake. You take your seat on a worn wooden bench. The stone walls seem to breathe with you, exhaling centuries of silence. There's no clock on the wall, no watch on your wrist, and yet everyone here knows what time it is. Matin, the first prayer of the day. It's still dark outside, the sky, ink black and absolute. But the monks have already begun. Their chant rises like mist, low and droning ancient syllables echoing from centuries past. You close your eyes and let the rhythm wrap around you. It's beautiful. It's slow. It's exactly what you didn't know you needed to fall asleep. The thing is, monks weren't early risers by accident. They believed every hour had its duty. Every breath had its place. Time was sacred. Time was marked. And you couldn't waste it, even if what you were doing with it was sitting very still and repeating words that you barely understood. There was something about that discipline, something oddly comforting. You didn't need to decide anything. The bell would decide for you. And if you were Brother Thomas, the one who had to climb the narrow stairs in the pre-dawn frost to ring the bell well, you probably dreamed of inventing something that would do it for you. Or at least something that didn't require you to wake up before the moon had gone to bed. You sit through the chant, then shuffle toward the kitchen. It's barely breakfast. Just a crust of bread, maybe some watered wine, maybe a boiled egg if someone's feeling generous. But it doesn't matter. Because what you're really tasting is time. Monastic time. Quiet time. Time that walks instead of runs. You're sleepy now. The bell still echoes faintly in your ear. You imagine the sound traveling across centuries, calling monks to wake, to chant, to start the world turning again with nothing but breath and bell. So yes, monks invented alarm clocks, not because they needed to make meetings or catch trains, but because they needed to pray. They needed to pray on time, and eventually, They got tired of trusting sleepy humans to wake each other up. They needed more than a bell. They needed a machine. But for now, just breathe. The chant fades. The candle flickers. And your eyes drift closed again, wrapped in wool silence and the rhythm of a life built around bells. You wake up again, but this time it's mid-morning. Light has spilled into the corridor, painting the stone floors in soft gold. The chill of pre-dawn prayers has faded, replaced by that familiar monastery warmth sun on slate heat rising from bread ovens, the rustle of robes as the monks begin their second or third tasks of the day. There's no bell this time, because once the first one rings, you're inside a rhythm. You don't need reminders anymore. This is the beauty and the curse of monastic life. You always know what comes next. Terze, a little prayer, then labor, then maybe a bit of cheese if it's a generous day. You follow the others through the cloister garden, passing low hedges and dew-dotted herbs. Bees hum lazily over the lavender. A cat blinks at you from a sun-warmed bench, clearly unconcerned with prayer schedules. You are quite literally on monk time. Now here's something funny about monk time. It's kind of fake. I mean, not completely. It's real enough for people who don't need precise minutes. But medieval monks didn't exactly have a Rolex strapped under their habits. What they had were bells, habits, shadows, and a deep commitment to routine. A typical Benedictine monastery divided the day into 8 parts. Canonical hours, they called them. You've already survived matins. Next comes lauds, then prime, then terce, then sext, then none, then vespers, then compline. If that sounds exhausting, it kind of is, but it's also deeply soothing. You don't decide what to do, the bells do. And if there's no bell, you learn to feel the time in your bones. Monks would use all kinds of cues to know what came next. The position of the sun through a specific window, the length of a shadow on a particular stair, the way the garden smelled when the sun hit the rosemary just right. Historians still argue whether some of these methods were deliberate or just slow accidents of pattern recognition. One theory says monks planted certain herbs in rows so the scent would change predictably as the light moved. Another says that's absolutely made up by modern romantics. You decide who to believe. But here's the important part: they didn't just guess. They watched. They listened. They learned to read the world like a clock. Still, there were problems. What if it was cloudy? What if Brother Thomas caught the flu? What if someone overslept and no one remembered matins until lauds had started? You can't exactly make up lost prayer like a missed meeting. You've missed your sacred cue. So eventually, some brilliant, exhausted, likely still holding a loaf of barley monk started wondering, what if the bell could ring itself? You're not quite at that point in the story yet. But the seeds have been planted. Because here's the thing about prayer and pattern. Once you rely on rhythm, you crave precision. You want the bell to ring not just around dawn, but at dawn. And not by Brother Thomas stumbling through the dark, but by something reliable, something mechanical, something a little clockish. But first, back to the garden. You settle near a patch of thyme and begin weeding. Your fingers dig through damp soil. Your robe sleeves keep slipping, but you don't bother adjusting them. This is the most meditative part of the day. No one talks much during labor, which makes it a great time to think about time. Right now, it's measured in weeds pulled, in sweat gathered, in the angle of the light. It's peaceful, but also inefficient. And monks, as sleepy as they weren't fans of waste. So in monasteries across Europe, especially as the 10th and 11th centuries rolled in, there came a quiet revolution, a revolution of gears. of water wheels, of little bits of metal and pressure and trickling and steam. It didn't look like much, but it was about to change everything. Back in your monastery, you've finished your row of weeds. The bell rings. Time to clean up and head inside. Terce is over. Now comes the scriptoria copying texts, transcribing psalms, illuminating those beautiful borders with gold leaf and tiny monks wrestling dragons. You pass a hallway lined with shelves. On one, you spot a peculiar device, a set of candles marked with lines. They look ordinary, but they're not. They're called graduated candles, and they're one of the earliest timekeeping tools in the monastic arsenal. The idea is simple. Each candle burns for a set amount of time, maybe an hour. As it melts, the wax passes marks on the side. You don't need numbers, just lines. Burn to mark 3, time for prayer. Candle clocks, they're called. Elegant, low-tech, and almost entirely useless on windy days. But for monks, they were a revelation. You could time without the sun. You could burn prayer into wax. You could read the day by fire. And yet, candles melt. They flicker. They drip unpredictably if someone sneezes nearby. So while some monasteries swore by candle clocks, others kept looking for something better. More permanent, more mechanical, more certain. Historians still argue whether these early candle clocks count as real clocks. Some say yes, they marked time. Others say no real clocks measure it, not just suggest it. Honestly, it depends how much you care about medieval arguments. You walk past the candle shelf, back to the chapel. The light is brighter now, the chant softer. The air smells of beeswax and parchment. You take your place again, close your eyes, and listen for the next bell. It'll come. They always do, even if just maybe one day. They come from something more precise than Brother Thomas. Maybe something with a spring, or a gear, or a wheel quietly turning behind a wooden panel, counting the seconds between you and your next prayer. You wake again, no wait, not quite wake. You drift upward like flower dust catching a breeze hovering between sleep and thought, and there it is, the bell. But this time it sounds different. Not the usual clang of a hand-wrung bronze mouth echoing down stone halls. This one is gentler, sharper maybe, regular, almost mechanical. Except you're still in a monastery. Still tucked into the folds of a world where prayers hold the day together and the sun plays timekeeper. So how could there be a machine? You rise and stretch. The chapel calls as it always does. But today your mind clings to the possibility that something other than Brother Thomas might be doing the ringing. Here's where things get interesting. Because somewhere, maybe not in your monastery, but certainly in one like it tucked between fields and forests in 11th century Europe, someone is tinkering. Not with theology, not with psalms, but with gears. You leave your dormitory and wander toward the bell tower, not out of rebellion, but out of curiosity. Imagine this. A monk stands at a work table littered with tools. Not hammers and saws, nothing so loud. No, these are delicate things. Calipers, weights, carved gears of oak and iron, and in the center a mechanism the size of a loaf of bread humming softly. The beginnings of a clock. Historians still argue about the first true mechanical clock. Some say it was built in a monastery in the 10th century. Others insist it wasn't until the 13th. But most agree that it started here in monastic life, where structure wasn't just tradition, it was salvation. If you missed prayers, you didn't just disappoint your brothers. You risked offending God. And God famously had a thing for punctuality. So it makes perfect sense that monks would be the first to build a device to keep divine time. Early clocks weren't clocks like we know them. They had no faces, no hands, They didn't tick-tock their way through the hours like a grandfather clock at your aunt's house. They rang. That's it. They were bells that rang on time. Because time wasn't about display, it was about action. You didn't need to see the hour. You just needed to hear it. That's why the first mechanical clocks were called bell-striking machines. And they were beautiful in their simplicity. A weight slowly dropped, turning a wheel which pushed a lever which lifted a hammer which struck a bell. Click, whir, clang. Time kept. But even before these weight-powered marvels, monks tried other things. Like water. Yes, water. Imagine a jar filled with water dripping steadily into another vessel. As the lower container fills, it pulls down a float attached to a string which eventually tips a mechanism. Boom. Bell rings. Time for terse. Water clocks had a noble lineage. The Greeks used them. So did the Chinese. So did Islamic engineers in the Golden Age, designing fantastical water-powered time beasts with dragons and automata. But monks, they used them quietly, practically. In the 12th century, one Cistercian monastery used a clepsydra, basically a fancy water clock, to make sure the nocturnal bell rang on time, even when clouds obscured the stars. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Still, water clocks had issues. They leaked. They froze in winter. They refused to cooperate with divine will. So naturally, the next step was to build something that didn't need sun or stars or stable temperature. Enter the escapement. Now, this part gets a little technical. But don't worry, I'll keep it sleepy. Imagine a wheel. Now imagine a tooth on that wheel being held back by a lever, which moves in a precise rhythm, letting the wheel go. Just a little. Then stopping it again. Then letting it go again. That tiny let go, stop, let go dance is what allows a clock to mark time evenly. It's called the verge and foliot escapement, and historians still debate who invented it. Some credit a 13th century English monk named Richard of Wallingford. Others say it came earlier from Islamic engineers or even Chinese tinkers. Whoever it was, they changed the game. Suddenly monks didn't have to guess. They didn't have to hope Brother Thomas was awake. They had a machine, a humming, turning, ringing machine, and it didn't care about cloudy skies or sleepy hands. You're walking the cloister again now, your feet slipping slightly on damp stone. You pause under the bell tower and look up. There's something comforting about knowing that a mechanism could whisper time just as gently as a breeze or a chant. Imagine the monks gathering around this new invention, hooded curious, watching as a gear turns, as a hammer lifts, as a bell rings on its own. It's not magic. But it feels like it, a kind of sacred sorcery, because now you don't just serve time. Time serves you. Of course, not every monk liked it. Some feared the intrusion, feared that something so precise might make prayer mechanical, not meaningful. Historians still argue whether these devices enhanced devotion or diluted it. One scholar writes, were they tools for worship or distractions from it? The answer, as always, is yes. You pass the scriptoria again. A candle flickers. Ink stains a fingertip. And outside, maybe not here, not yet, a bell chimes by itself. The monks look up, nod, bow their heads, because even when the hand of man lifts from the bell rope, the hand of time remains. You find yourself tracing the curve of a stone archway with your fingers, the ridges smooth and cool beneath your touch. Somewhere in the quiet echo of the cloister, a bell chimes not from a human hand this time, but something else. A hint of precision. A rhythm so steady it could only come from gears turning in secret. You glance upward. They're perched like a quiet gargoyle on the far wall, is the earliest form of a mechanical escapement bell. Simple, wooden, but very much alive in its own way. Like a pet project that grew legs and started walking time forward for everyone else. Imagine being a monk the day they first installed it. You stand in the courtyard, staring at this box of wheels and ropes and clunks, and wonder if it will replace Brother Matthias entirely. That's both exciting and a little sad. Brother Matthias, after all, was a bit of a character. Known for ringing too early when he was hungry, and too late if the sun looked particularly nap-worthy. The machine doesn't nap. Not everyone embraced it. In fact, some monks worried that surrendering to a device would make the soul lazy, that instead of watching the sun or feeling the pulse of the day, they'd become slaves to something man-made. But others saw it as divine order, because this wasn't just about ringing a bell. This was about measuring devotion. The Rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century document that shaped monastic life across Europe, didn't leave a lot of wiggle room when it came to structure. Let the brothers rise without delay, it said, and hasten to the work of God. Vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. 7 times a day the monks prayed, each moment a checkpoint for the soul. Missing one wasn't a small deal, it was spiritual negligence. You weren't just late to a meeting, you were late to grace. So having a bell ring exactly when it should, that was mercy. Now here's where it gets wonderfully weird. In 996, a monk named Gerbert of Aurillac, who would later become Pope Sylvester II, reportedly designed a kind of proto-clock using weights and gears, not just to ring a bell, but to mark the hours. Scholars are still scratching their heads about whether he actually built it, or just wrote about it in that overly poetic, I had a vision way monks sometimes favored. But whether or not Gerbert's invention existed, the seed was planted. Monks started thinking about mechanical time. Some drew diagrams of how stars might power gears. Others started carving gear teeth from boxwood and hiding escapement models under their beds. And somewhere in this storm of sacred order and sleepless minds, a question was asked. What if we didn't have to wait for the stars to tell us it was prime? You step into a small chamber just off the main cloister. It smells like parchment and dust. A tiny model sits on the table. One gear, a weight, a string. Nothing impressive, but next to it, a sketch, an ink drawing of a mechanical bell. It shows a wheel turning slowly, a rod lifting a hammer rising, a bell chiming. Over and over. Someone was dreaming, and the dream was catching on. By the 13th century, these early mechanisms started appearing in monasteries across Europe. Not just in large abbeys, but even in smaller ones where precision was more than a luxury. It was the only way to keep the community synchronized when cloudy skies made sundials useless. Sundials, after all, were elegant liars, beautiful but mute in storms, and candles too smoky, too prone to accidental snuffing. A machine that kept ticking even when no one watched. That was revolutionary. But also, let's be honest, slightly suspicious. Remember, this is medieval Europe. The average person still thinks thunder is angels bowling. Machines that do something on their own start to feel a little too close to magic. Some monks feared the appearance of witchcraft. Others whispered of time spirits who might live inside the gears. One rumor claimed that a Benedictine monk built a clock so accurate it could predict eclipses. Another said it ran on the soul of a nightingale caught in a copper cage. Historians, of course, dismiss these as myths, probably. Still, you can't help but grin at the thought of a tiny bird inside a gear-powered time box, chirping every hour on the hour like a feathery alarm. Meanwhile, back in your imaginary cloister, Brother Matthias is officially on early retirement. The bell rings by itself now. And even though he pretends not to notice, you catch him smiling when it chimes. Because it's still his bell, just slightly smarter. You walk past the garden now. The lavender smells sharper in the early air. A bee bumbles lazily from blossom to blossom, completely unaware of the precision that now governs the Abbey's schedule. It doesn't care what time it is. It only knows what needs doing. You think maybe monks and bees have that in common. So the machine ticks, the hours pass, and slowly monastic life shifts from celestial time to mechanical time. Not all at once, but steadily. A weight drops, a gear turns, a hammer lifts, and a bell sings. And everyone bows their head not to the clock, but to the moment it delivers. A bell rings in the distance, soft, steady, patient. You let the sound travel through you like a breeze anchoring you to the moment. Then you open your eyes, still in the monastery, still surrounded by damp stone and the faint warmth of rising bread. Because of course the monks bake. Even divine schedules need snacks. You wander past the scriptorium quiet this time of morning, save for a quill scratching somewhere behind a pillar. And then your eyes land on it, a little wooden box perched just above the door. It looks like it's doing nothing, but inside, a gear is turning. A weight is falling. Time in its gentlest form is being kept. By the late 13th century, monasteries across Europe had begun building what we might cautiously call clocks. Not the tick-tock kind you'd hang on your wall or set to the minute, more like timekeeping sculptures. Iron frames, spinning drums, rods that clicked over pegs. Some didn't even have faces. They were just mechanisms that rang bells at regular intervals, carefully calibrated with sand weights, pulleys, and if you were lucky, a reliable brother who knew how to wind things up just right. The idea was spreading. Benedictine, Cistercian, Cluniac. All different flavors of monk, all sharing the same obsession, divine punctuality. Here's a lovely detail you probably didn't need, but now can't unknow. One of the first documented mechanical clocks was built in 1283 in Dunstable Priory, England. It didn't just chime the hour. It rang specific tones for different parts of the day, each linked to a prayer or scripture reading. A musical alarm clock for Jesus. And just imagine there you are rolling out of a hay-stuffed mattress, rubbing your eyes, and instead of a jarring metal clang, you hear a soft series of tones signaling terse. You stretch, yawn, and think, ah, yes. The Holy Spirit requests my presence. With harmony. Of course, not everyone had these instruments yet. They were rare, expensive, built by craftspeople who had to invent the tools just to make the tools. Each one was bespoke, usually the size of a wagon wheel, and required a minor miracle to keep running. Still, the idea was out of the monastery and into the world. Cities started building communal clocks mounted in church towers or civic halls. Not for prayer necessarily, for power. Because here's where it gets interesting. While monks built clocks to serve God, merchants began adopting them to serve business. See, in a city, time is money. Quite literally. When the bell rings at noon, that's when the market opens. If it rings late, vendors complain. If it rings early, the baker's rye loaf is still raw in the middle. Commerce demands consistency, so towns commission clocks, big ones, loud ones, ones that chimed across rooftops and echoed down cobbled streets. Not once, not twice, but every hour on the hour, like a heartbeat carved in bronze. And here's your fun twist of fate. The monks, those champions of sacred schedule, ended up inspiring the first wave of secular timekeeping. Trade fairs, banking houses, merchant guilds, they all took their cue from monastic discipline, which makes sense when you think about it. A monastery is just a medieval version of a startup close quarters long hours, shared goals, occasional chanting, and monks. Basically the original productivity hackers. They even had time blocking down centuries before your favorite calendar app. Wake, pray, study, copy, bake, clean, pray again. Every task with its assigned window. You miss one that's not just reschedule, that's penance and extra dish duty. Now, as you shuffle through the cloister garden, a breeze rustles the herbs. Mint, rosemary, sage. You pause at a bench and listen. The bell chimes. And for a moment, you wonder how many people heard that sound at the same moment you did. A baker down the road, a weaver in the market, a child learning to count by the bell's rhythm. Time isn't just ticking now, it's connecting. But back in the abbey, the old gear-driven clocks still click away quietly. Not glamorous, not precise by modern standards. They need constant tending, winding, adjusting, listening. And this is where we meet the horologist. No, not someone who studies horoscopes, though fair guess. A horologist is a clockmaker. And if you were a monk with any mechanical ability, maybe a little bored during matins, maybe a little too curious during lunch, this might become your life's calling. These men became sacred engineers. They carved gear teeth from boxwood and shaped pinions with iron files. They measured weights not in pounds, but in seconds, timing the fall to perfect their escapement. And they did it without watches, without electricity, without blueprints, just by watching the sky, listening to bells and tinkering until it felt right. Historians still argue whether these early clocks were precise or just persuasive after all. If nobody had a personal watch who could tell the difference. But here's the secret. Precision wasn't the point. Rhythm was. The clocks didn't tell you the exact time. They reminded you there was a time. To rise, to pray, to rest, to return. And in a world that didn't yet divide the day into 24 hours, with Siri whispering reminders that rhythm mattered more than accuracy ever could. You look up now. The sky has shifted. The sun is higher. Another bell chimes. Maybe not perfectly on the hour, but perfectly enough. And as the monks file past silent-robed focused, you see it in their steps. Not haste, not delay, just harmony. And in the background, the clock ticks on. Not loudly, just enough to say time is here. And we are keeping it together. The monastery feels slower now, like a song in its final verse. The bells still chime, the candles still flicker, but the air has shifted. You walk past the cloistered garden again, the same row of sage and mint, and think monks weren't just praying, they were building an empire of rhythm. And you sleepy traveler are drifting right into the heart of it. Because here's a question you never asked, but now can't shake: why bells? Why not horns or birds or someone just shouting terse time every morning until the abbey crumbles? Well, it turns out bells were the perfect technology for a place trying to keep order without chaos. They're loud, but not jarring. Musical, but unmistakable. You don't ignore a bell. You pause for it. You listen. And the monks didn't invent bells, of course. That honor likely goes to the ancient Chinese or the wandering blacksmiths of early Iron Age Europe. But medieval monks, they weaponized them for peace. Most monasteries had at least one large bell, usually housed in a central tower, and someone assigned the enviable task of bell ringer. This was not a casual gig. You needed to know the difference between matins and lauds, between prime and vespers. Ring too early and you disrupt morning prayers. Ring too late and you get roasted during supper. But even this system had flaws. Because brace yourself, sometimes monks fell asleep. Yes, even the devout ones. Even the ones who wore itchy robes and ate boiled turnips and believed naps were tools of Satan. Sometimes they just missed the bell. And that, my friend, is how the first alarm clock was born. Now don't picture a little silver dial with a hammer and twin bells sitting on a nightstand. We're talking about water clocks, also known as clepsydras. These were bowls or jugs that filled or emptied at a steady rate, marking time through flow. In some clever models, when the water reached a certain level, it would trigger a mechanical action, like releasing a small ball that rang a chime or knocked into a gong. Basically, monks were building Rube Goldberg machines hundreds of years before Rube Goldberg was even born. Here's your fringe fact. For the night, there's a 12th century manuscript that describes a monastic alarm device involving a suspended weight, a water drum, and a bell that rang exactly 7 times, no more, no less. It was built to wake a particularly forgetful monk during matins. Apparently it worked. For a week. Historians still argue whether this machine truly qualifies as the first alarm clock, or whether it was just an elaborate prank. But either way, the idea stuck, because let's be real, waking up is hard. Even for people who believe their immortal souls depend on it. You shuffle down a hallway now and glance through a doorway into a narrow cell, stone walls, wooden bed, a single candle flickering beside a pile of scrolls. On the wall, a small painted spiral. Familiar, reassuring. You think back to the monastery's clock tower and wonder how many hands have wound its gears. How many sleepy brothers stumbled through darkness just to whisper a prayer at the right moment. And you realize this wasn't about precision. It was about discipline, pattern, shared purpose. Monks weren't trying to tell time. They were trying to belong to it. And when something broke that rhythm, a storm silencing the bells, a faulty weight in the clock, they didn't panic. They adapted. They prayed by memory. They whispered the hours. They counted heartbeats instead of chimes. That's what makes this history feel somehow more human than mechanical. The monk who oversleeps and rewinds the clock with guilt in his gut. The brother who stays up just to make sure the bell rings for lauds. The young novice who carves a new gear with trembling fingers because the last one cracked in the cold. And somewhere in that rhythm, that slow, deliberate orchestration of silence and sound, you start to understand why these men kept time at all. Not for control, not for ego, but for presence, for saying, here I am, again, still, now. You move into the refectory, the dining hall, long, empty benches, polished by centuries of elbows. At the head of the table, a smaller bell rests on a plank. This one is for meals. It rings when the bread is broken, the prayers are said, the bowls are filled with soup that tastes the same every day. Even eating is timed. Even chewing, probably. And you realize something else: clocks didn't make people more productive. They made people more aware of how fleeting a sunrise can be, of how soft a candle flame is when the bell for Compline chimes, of how many steps it takes to walk the spiral path from door to altar before the next hour strikes. That's why monks invented clocks, not for commerce, not for ambition, but for rhythm, for connection, for the shared heartbeat that tells everyone you're not alone in this silence. The bell rings again. Somewhere a monk turns a crank. Somewhere water fills a bowl. Somewhere a soul stirs and thinks, time to begin again. And you, listener of sleepy stories and sacred routines, you smile at the thought. Because maybe, just maybe, that monk from 900 years ago is not so different from you. Trying to wake up, trying to do the next right thing, trying to remember what matters before the clock strikes again. By now, you're fully settled into the monastery's rhythm, not because you've mastered Latin chants or developed a sudden fondness for barley stew, but because your bones have begun to understand the lull and lift of monastic time. You wake when the bells wake. You pause when the candlelight shifts. You breathe in that curious mixture of incense wax and baked stone that only places like this seem to hold. And tonight, we're stepping into one of the most ambitious timekeeping inventions of the medieval world, the mechanical tower clock. That's right. At some point, monks looked at their lovely water clocks dribbling along, doing their best, and thought, we can do better. Or maybe we're tired of cleaning up puddles. So sometime around the late 13th century, you start seeing the rise, quite literally, of massive timekeeping towers in monastic communities and town centers. Tall, brooding things with gearwork at their hearts and bells at their crowns. These were not subtle. These clocks weren't just for monks anymore. They were for everyone. Imagine this. You're walking through a chilly courtyard in northern Italy. Your sandals are wet. The sky is threatening drizzle as usual, and suddenly clang. A deep bronze bell booms from above. It's not noon. It's not midnight. It's the 3rd hour after sunrise, and now the entire town knows it. These early mechanical clocks didn't have faces or hands. Nope, just bells. Just sound. They were quite literally talking clocks. The inner workings, oh, they were wild. Gears the size of wagon wheels, ropes wound around stone weights, wooden escapements, ticking like giant metronomes. And often all of it powered by gravity. You'd hoist the weights up every day, or sometimes multiple times a day, just to keep the gears moving. It was like feeding a very grumpy metal dragon that told you when to eat your porridge. One of the earliest known examples, the clock at Salisbury Cathedral in England, built around 1386. It had no dial, just a system of levers and a bell that rang every hour. And here's the kicker, it's still around. Still ticking. More or less. Historians still argue whether these clocks were accurate or just impressive. Because honestly, medieval folks weren't too fussed about precision down to the minute. Being within 15 minutes of an event that was practically Swiss timing for them. Instead, what mattered was the consistency. The clock struck, the monks bowed, the townspeople paused, and the day unfolded again and again with that steady pulse echoing through stone alleys and open courtyards. You step into the monastery's bell tower, now wooden stairs creaking beneath you, dust motes dancing in the high light. The gears are turning. You can hear them, a low grind, a steady click. Above, the rope sways gently with the pull of the weight. It's like a heartbeat. Mechanical and patient. A friar passes you a cloth. Wipe the teeth, he says, nodding to a gear. You oblige. And as you do, you feel oddly honored, like you're helping time do its job, which is more poetic than practical. But that's the mood up here. Eventually, you reach the top. The view worth every splinter. The rooftops stretch out in patchwork rows, terracotta and slate, soot-streaked and bird-pecked. Smoke curls lazily from chimneys. The sky is that murky blue of late evening when the stars haven't arrived, but the sun's already checking out. And then the bell chimes. You cover your ears just a little too late. It's not painful, just full. A sound that fills your chest and rearranges your bones. It tells the world you're here. You're alive. Pay attention. And somewhere below in the bakery, someone nods and pulls a loaf from the oven. Somewhere in the chapel, a monk bows deeper into prayer. Somewhere on the street, a child counts the echoes. This is what the monks invented clocks for. Not just to keep time, but to share it. To synchronize the lives of hundreds, maybe thousands, who otherwise would drift like leaves on different winds. And this system, it spread fast. By the 14th century, towns across Europe were competing to build the biggest, loudest, most intricate clocks possible. Some added automata mechanical figures that moved with each chime, roosters that flapped, kings that nodded, even death itself swinging a tiny scythe at the hour. Yes, medieval Europe really knew how to keep things chipper. There's a town in Germany where the clock features a dancing skeleton that twirls every time the bell rings. The message, time is ticking. Better enjoy your cabbage. Monks might have been the first to build these marvels, but cities were the ones that turned them into civic pride. They weren't just timepieces, they were landmarks, power symbols, and in a weird way, very loud comfort blankets. You lean back against the cold stone and listen to the last echoes of the bell fade into the valley. A dog barks, a shutter closes, and in that hush you realize something. This clock doesn't just mark the hours, it holds them. It catches them like fireflies in glass and says, "Here. Remember this." And so you do. Even now, centuries later, in the soft warmth of a digital glow, your alarm set for the morning. You still owe something to that monk who stayed up to wind a gear, who whispered a prayer as the bell rang out over sleeping fields, who believed that time, like bread and silence, should be shared. By now, you're comfortably nestled in the rhythm of this curious, clanging history. The bells still ringing softly in your memory, like echoes bouncing off the walls of a long-forgotten abbey. But tonight's focus shifts slightly, from grand towers and hammering gears to the quieter tick of intention. Because as clocks grew taller and louder, monks also began crafting something more intimate, more personal, mechanical alarm systems. Not for towns, not for travelers, but for themselves. Because let's be honest, no matter how devoted you are, waking up at 2:47 in the morning to chant about eternal salvation is still hard. Especially when it's cold and your cot feels like a whisper of heaven in itself. Hence the humble invention of monastic alarm clocks. You shuffle through the cloisters now, candle in hand, the wax dripping like lazy snowflakes onto the stone floor. It's the darkest part of night, the space between yesterday and today, and the only sound is your own breath puffing little clouds into the chill. Down the hall, you glimpse it, a strange contraption resting beside a cot, gears exposed like bones, a weight suspended by a rope, and a tiny bell wired just so. This isn't the steampunk dreamscape of modern fantasy art. It's clunky, hand-forged, slightly off-center, but it works. Because when the gear unwinds just right, click, 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 it releases a lever that strikes the bell. Not a grand cathedral gong, but a modest ping. Just enough to rouse one sleeping monk at exactly the time they promised God they'd be up and praising. And here's where it gets weird, because yes, it always does. Some of these personal alarm systems were hydraulic. That's right. Monks were channeling tiny streams of water into calibrated buckets. Drip by drip, hour by hour, the water would rise until it tipped. A scale triggered a pulley and rang a bell. If you're thinking, this sounds like a slow-motion Rube Goldberg machine, you're absolutely right. Except instead of a hamster pushing a domino, it was a tired monk hoping gravity would be merciful this time. Historians still argue whether these alarms were widespread or more like curiosity's tools of the particularly devout or particularly sleep-averse. Some monasteries mention them in their logs, others don't.